Did you know that the reality of ancient farming was very different from what we imagine? In fact, historians often get it wrong. Ancient farming was much more advanced than you imagine. So, how did the Romans farm? Let's go back a couple of years, thousands of years to be exact, and find out all about just how the Romans farmed in history during the time of the Roman Empire. The reasons Romans invented advanced farming are complicated. Among them are that they needed to feed their population, they were running out of forests, which they used for food, and they needed more water. Another reason is that there was less arable land than there is now. The climate was wetter, soils were less fertile. For thousands of years, the Romans relied on natural forces: gravity, air, water, and the sun. For thousands of years, farmers had dried their crops in the sun, but rain eventually ruined it, so they started drying them indoors by hanging them on rocks. The Romans invented farming because they found that nature wasn't entirely cooperative. They realized that nature had limits. They needed a new kind of agriculture. So, the Romans created an advanced type of farming that depended on both the nature and their ingenuity. With the knowledge they had for crop rotation, they planted different crops each year. Crop rotation was important. Farmers initially alternated between growing grains and raising pigs. They also sometimes alternate between irrigated and drained land. When the drained fields were flooded, the fertilizer from the manure helped to grow more grain. When the irrigated fields were flooded, the water drained away more quickly, reducing the risk of pests and diseases. Crop rotation and rotation between different kinds of farms helped farmers avoid disease. They also grew legumes, which fertilized the soil, but they still needed water. So they built canals to carry water from rivers to fields, but also built them on steep hillsides so that gravity could push the water down to the areas. The size of a farm depended on what kind of land it was. Arable land was either irrigated or drained, and either flat or hilly. Flat land needed fewer workers because it was easier to plow. Hilly land needed more workers because the land had to be tilled and terraced. Arable land was divided into small fields, each about 5 hectares. Workers walked between them carrying their own tools and supplies. These fields were growing grain. Fields for raising pigs, sheep, and cattle were much larger. Fields for growing grapes and olives were smaller than those for growing grain and were farmed usually with slaves. Grapes and olives were then usually sold to traders who shipped them to Rome. Orchards and vineyards were farmed by slaves, but the owners sometimes allowed their workers to own some of the land. Were the Romans really the first people to master farming? When historians talk about the ancient ways of farming, they usually talk about farming systems, not techniques. But who could have thought that Roman farming systems were so complex? The Romans had several agricultural methods, including irrigation and drainage, and used many different crops and animals. But the basic farming system they used was very much like what we now call modern agriculture. For example, the Romans had techniques for growing the same crop in different conditions. They tended to produce the same things, in the same proportions, for which they used a specific order. In the ancient world, farms were large, and just one single farmer's productivity usually depended on many lands. The Romans were no exception either. Most of them were farmers, and most of them owned a lot of land. In the fields, farmers tended to follow natural patterns. They planted in a way that allowed crops to grow all year round, and of course, had livestock to help make the ground more fertile. So, the reality of ancient agriculture was nothing like the ancient way we were taught to believe. It was much more like nowadays if we compare them. The only difference? Lack of technology. Since the Romans couldn't mass transport, there was not enough food to go around. So food was rationed and people starved. And when I say mass transport and not mass produce, it was because Roman farmers produced a lot of food and it wasn't enough. So much of it was wasted. Roman farmers didn't worry about this. They would get their profit and plenty of food for their families either way. The problem was all in transporting food into the cities. Before food could arrive in cities, some of it went to animals, farmers, but worst of all, most of it would rot. So how did Rome deal with this problem? Some of the farmers came up with the idea to own slaves to do different jobs for them. So, with their agriculture being very labor-intensive, Romans needed a lot of agricultural workers. They had 2 main ways of getting them: slaves and prisoners of war. The slaves they bought from other rich people. The prisoners of war were captured in battle. cattle. They grew so much that the Roman army needed a separate Roman army to collect crops for itself. Moreover, these slaves required so much grain, olives, and grapes that the Romans exported most of them to Africa, Spain, Britain, and Germany. The slaves that remained working for the Romans were paid enough for food, and that made the difference between survival and starvation. But slaves weren't really that useful. It's hard to imagine, but they would usually escape their owners or sometimes even throw a riot just so they would stop working. So the Romans came up with a better idea, that of hiring farming specialists, who were people who grew food to sell. They call it ager, a word with roots in the Latin for farming. The agers were small settlements, like farms, that grew and sold food. The business was really profitable and eased fast transportation of food in cities. So this soon led to agers being created all over the Roman Empire. The agers were modeled on farms. They had fields and they were crowded with the families of workers and animals. So unlike farms, the agers were more like villages. But where did Romans actually farm? The Mediterranean shores, of course. This includes North Africa, Spain, the Peloponnese, Italy, and Sicily. They grew wheat and barley and grapes, and were also known to grow almonds, figs, cucumbers, melons, peas, potatoes, onions, peaches, apricots, and olives. Roman farms were usually located near rivers and seasides because irrigation was so necessary. They also used a system of ditches and canals to water their farms. They kept cattle, cows, and goats for milk and cheese. They also kept oxen for hauling loads. They kept bees for honey and raised chickens, pigs, and ducks for meat and eggs. Not a bit different from what farmers do now. They used many different kinds of farm tools, including plows, seed drills, and grain threshers. One of the most exciting things about ancient farms is that they were almost entirely self-sufficient. There was no point in going to the Roman market unless you had something you needed. So they grew enough wheat and barley to feed themselves, and almost every middle-class family raised their own cattle, sheep, chickens, ducks, geese, and bees. The Romans' focus on farming brought the empire enormous wealth. With such massive agriculture and extensive trade, Rome had a massive surplus of agricultural and industrial products. It was an enormous surplus in world history till the Industrial Revolution. However, the Romans didn't become rich because they got rich by exporting surplus products. Instead, they got rich by shipping one product, money. They created the first paper money. They made piles of it. First, they exchanged money for things they couldn't grow or produce themselves, like bronze, jewelry, glass, cloth, horses, slaves, and grain. They shipped money, made it useful, and then exported and started selling surplus products that made them rich both ways. Romans also took the gods too seriously when it came to farming. The Romans' attitude is weird but easy to understand. They believed that if the gods liked you, you were more likely to get what you wanted. If they didn't like you, you were more likely to get punished. So the Romans made sure the gods were on their side. The Romans thought that the gods had a plan of their own. So such a belief made a lot of noise in Roman culture. If the gods disapproved of your crops, they punished you. If they didn't like the way you served them, they punished you. Because of this, the Romans stopped worrying about what the gods would think, and they started worrying about what the gods would do. The Romans thought that one way the gods might punish you was by giving them bad luck. So according to them, they had to understand how the gods were going to play. They had to make sure they got what they wanted. So the Romans gave a portion of what they made to their gods. They winnowed the wheat and heated the ovens for them. This giving ritual usually took 3 days, and when the wheat was baked, the loaves were broken off and set on reed mats and covered with straw. The straw was then sawed off, and the loaves were carried to temples and laid on golden tablets. Maybe it was the power of belief and the fear of the gods that led the Romans to become one of the best farmers in the ancient world. What do you think? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching.